The Afterdeath Journal of an American Philosopher by Jane Roberts. Chapter 3. Freud, Jung, and Protestantism. Saturday morning, February 5th, 1977. I amused myself after death, wondering what different kind of vision Jung might have presented if Freud had not been his teacher, or if he, rather than Freud, had been the elder. Freud's emotionalism gave me concern, for I considered him somewhat of a religious fanatic, operating outside of religion's conventional context. In many ways, he was a shaman, born in the wrong country, twice as jealous of his own masculine characteristics because he sensed within himself the perverse, intuitive rushes and psychic leanings that he feared and believed could undermine the personal authority of the ego and the mass authority of the state. In many ways, also, Freud's theories represented the darker aspects of Protestantism. I'm sorry, I'm having a lot of trouble pronouncing that word, so you're going to have to forgive me. I'll just start the sentence over again. In many ways, also, Freud's theories represented the darker aspects of Protestantism, cut free from the conventional belief of an omnipotent God released from optimistic ascensions into heaven, a psychological hell replacing the earlier theological one, and demons turned into the primitive impulses which were stamped upon the psyche in its infancy. Oh my goodness, what a sentence. Let me read the sentence again. This is somewhat hard to understand, I think. Okay. In many ways, also, Freud's theories represented the darker aspects of Protestantism. Okay, represented the darker aspects. Okay. Cut free from the conventional belief of an omnipotent God, released from optimistic ascensions into heaven, a psychological hell, replacing the earlier theological one, and demons turned into the primitive impulses which were stamped upon the psyche in its infancy. In such a manner, the most pessimistic elements of Protestantism were given a new scientific face and sophisticated justification, just at a time when organized Protestantism was embarked on a new venture in America, stressing the active, aggressive, hopeful aspects of personality that would test the individual's capacities to rule his own society with a government based not upon fear, but upon freely accepted restraints, adapted to the service of the highest aspirations of man. So, Protestantism became schizophrenic. Its bleaker side expressed in disguised form through Freud's theories, its drive for salvation, allied with democracy's conventional churches. That drive towards salvation, nationally expressed, was translated as salvation through triumph over poverty, over the class systems of Europe, and over the land itself, with the help of growing technology. Nothing was to stand in its way. The democracy's deepest fears and hesitations, and its unspoken suspicions that its ideals might be too high, were expressed in Freud's hypnotic reminders that the natural self could not be trusted. Freud's unconscious represented the individual's past. And for Americans, it also represented the new democracy's roots in convoluted European heritage. Freud actually gave Puritanism a new basis, since he provided a scientific framework in which man's nature was seen as basically untrustworthy, in need of constant scrutiny, in which even the unseemingly highest acts of man could have the darkest motives. Psychoanalysis replaced the Catholic confessional. The psychologist became the new priest, in a maneuver of deepest significance by which Freud returned to Protestantism and the elements dismissed by Luther, and reinstated the go-between separating God and man. Only this time that go-between was the psychologist, who stood between the conscious and the subconscious elements of man. The individual no longer needed a priest to interpret God's words or the Bible, but instead required an interpreter to understand the unconscious and unsavory aspects of his own psychological identity, for there he had lost his authority. Had this maneuver been accomplished through the policies of a clearly stated religious movement, a new Luther would have risen, acclaiming once again the individual's right to interpret his own religious reality. Or had Freud been less convinced of the malevolent nature of the subconscious, his own shamanistic qualities would have burst forth in a greater vision of salvation, providing a truly meaningful version of psychological redemption rather than the restrictive techniques of psychoanalysis that in fact resulted. Okay. Attempts of that kind did rise in Freud's behavior with Jung. By then, however, Freud's life had been largely spent in constructing theories that reflected his own psychic organizations and frameworks. To change these theories would involve far more than making minor or even major adjustments to a life's work, but would necessitate the birth of a new inner man. To Freud, Jung represented that man. Literally, in psychological terms, a messiah springing out of the experience of the father, Freud, and it was in that light Freud saw himself in regard to Jung. With admiration, jealousy, and the strongest sense of fascination, Freud watched Jung outgrow him, and no matter what Freud did or said, he knew that the interactions between himself and Jung provided exactly the kind of tension that added to Jung's growth. When Jung's theories did mature, it was in the new field of psychology. He was psychology's Luther. In a way, of course, psychology's Luther was religion's loss, for Protestantism remained schizophrenic, and even in your time, it has not again realistically come to terms with the good and evil aspects of man in relation to God or nature. That failure led directly to the birth of parapsychology, which tried to address the elements of the soul that religion refused to examine. There were naturally overlapping in these processes earlier. Let me read that again. There were naturally overlappings in these processes. Earlier, for example, Myers was a much more beneficial example of a man immersed in questions of the soul and personality with religious and scientific bents, merged advantageously, yet he did not give voice or expression to those submerged darker elements that were more apparent after Victorian closed curtains opened, those tendencies that democracy needed to understand and use, but instead conventionally denied. As a result of these issues, American seances beautifully and sometimes hilariously portrayed the idiosyncrasies of religion and science, both in the adaptation of Freudian principles to religious experience or mystical behavior, while democracy spouted patriotic slogans about the ability of the individual to join in a self-governing society. Then Freudianism let the soul slip away, stripped of its powers, which were delegated to a mechanical reaction of instinctive drives that could be numbered and diagrammed in a sort of muddy emotional shorthand. The soul disappeared, becoming instead a psychological chamber of horrors, requiring the most expert of guides, for inside there were distorted mirrors that could show the unwary in a flash the grotesque basis for the greatest achievements and the sorriest failures. And the next session came on Monday morning, February 7th, 1977. It seemed sheer idiocy to look there for any of man's redeeming characteristics, for altruism and greed alike were seen as the result of mechanical, repetitive psychological processes that caused man to act in a given way. Predestination was given new and biological scientific clothes. In such a framework, men could not take credit for their achievements or be held responsible for their blunders, and self-determination was sorely undermined. Such ideas clashed with all of democracy's stated ideals, yet were held equally with them. Many of these issues largely escaped me in life, yet I should have sensed their shape more clearly. Had I been more adventuresome, I might have helped tip the balance, or at least I might have pointed out the contradictions between these two opposing areas of thought and philosophy. To this end, I now speak my piece. For the attitudes that finally emerged in the mainstream of American life strongly affected the ways in which individuals viewed themselves and their creativity. Not only was man robbed of true satisfaction with creative work, but he was led to preserve his own doubts and torments, since they were seen as responsible for art's achievement. Artistic production was tied to a neurotic birth, and the artist in whatever field began to hoard conflicts, imagining that they were the source of his productivity. And now there's a little section where Jane speaks. After getting the previous material Monday morning, I took a break and I did some household chores. Then Rob and I had lunch. I was in the middle of our gourmet feast of soup and peanut buttered crackers when suddenly the James material started up again very quickly. I kept putting down my soup spoon to take notes. I dropped my cracker in the pea soup. Finally, we just cut lunch short, and I went back to my typewriter. It was a damp day in the 20s. That would be Fahrenheit. But James was energetic, to say the least. I felt as if both of us were taking a walk on a brisk autumn day somewhere, with him passionately discoursing. And now we get back to James. Death has its own pleasures, allowing you to comment in leisure upon your own time, seeing what came before and what after, and judging how many of those future developments you saw or understood in their embryonic form. If in the past genius and madness were considered allied, both were seen in a heroic light, in their connections one to the other, and if genius was sometimes tinged with madness, so was insanity tinged with genius. The heights and depths of man's soul were each seen by Freud, however, as the result of infantile behavior patterns that rigidly controlled man for his lifetime, the grandest dimensions of experience reduced to a psychological determinism from which only the deepest self-examination could bring redemption, a psychological journey that no one could safely take alone, and one in which the individual was most likely to misread the direction of his own bents, having been taught to scrutinize precisely those spontaneous leanings meant to serve as psychological directional signals. Creativity became no more than enlightened insanity, and insanity a distorted creativity. Both were seen as the inevitable results of conditioning and neurotic cravings, over which the individual had little control. Protestantism was based upon man's right to interpret truth for himself on an individual basis, thus directly challenging the authority of the Roman Catholic Church as the only agency capable of such discrimination, and upon an attempt to put the individual in a one-to-one relationship with God and the universe. In ways, this was a paganistic adventure, reviving ancient characteristics of religion that had been buried, but not lost when, for example, shamanistic genius was used for the community or tribal good. Freud, however, took that Protestant right away. The individual was seen as incapable of knowing his own motives, much less able to interpret his own relationship with nature or the soul. Freudianism was then based upon the less fortunate of Protestantism's concepts, while stripping it of its heroic qualities. Nowhere was the search for truth considered a natural component of personality. The penis replaced the cross. Thus, one half of the species, the more intuitively inclined, was denied redemption. And if the cross was itself in many ways a maligned religious symbol, it offered salvation to man and woman alike. Beneath it, the sinner still retained his dignity as an individual capable of free action, who had but chosen poorly. Freudianism replaced the saint and the sinner alike with a mechanical psychological man, programmed from childhood to fail or succeed, and tied man's grandest symbols to their least beneficial manifestation. If religion is as embodied in Protestantism had failed in large measure, its many denominations did allow for various interpretations: salvation through good thoughts, prayer, or good works, through private contemplation or public achievement, personal revelation, or strict biblical reference. The educated and illiterate could each find a place. So too the virgin, mother, prostitute, scholar, working man, the child, and the adult. The fit of the individual into the framework was perhaps a poor one at times, but there was a psychic mobility, and the sinner could become the saint. Granted, a shallowness ruled. The good person wore decent clothes and modeled a cheerful countenance, but the democracy hoped to provide those opportunities by which the poverty-stricken could discover employment. In Freudianism, however, the poor could not help being poor due to neurotic conditioning in infancy, their drives forever frozen, mobilized, so that they were robbed, in theory at least, of the self-determination allowed to others. as women were. For all of their drives were assigned to a sexual envy of the male that they could not escape. The effect of all this was to reduce the importance of individual creativity, and also to place it in a more suspect light than earlier, and worse, to encourage the artist to keep whatever spiritual or psychic discomfort he had, to forsake understanding, lest, along with his torments, he lose his creativity. Since the creative powers always seek fulfillment and are innately curious about the self and all aspects of its reality, the artist was put into a position where he tried to use his creativity and not use it at the same time, lest his insights lead him to his creativity's source in infantile dependency, and then disintegrate in understanding's light. Okay. And the next section, I'm hesitating a little because for me, there's some ahas here. Whoa. So, William James certainly has insights, doesn't he? Tuesday morning, February 8th, 1977. This is James again. Since no one could be trusted to know the motives for his own actions, and since the democracy was setting the individual free of strong governmental authority to a new degree, psychology set its own standards, providing the norm, flattening the peaks of experience, while offering society the safety or more or less predictable behavior. In that framework, exuberance, energy, and creativity were acceptable when channeled into the competitive arena of national interests. The rich, for example, were absolved from normal behavior and allowed artistic or eccentric activity because their financial interests were considered such a practical investment in national life. Yet, the social and business arenas themselves were unpredictable. Poor immigrant might be tomorrow's millionaire, and in such a psychological environment, the old rules of social protocol based upon European class and class systems could not be counted upon as smooth bridges of communication. The theory of the independent individual ruled, and precisely because of the country's freedom and unpredictable social and economic climate, the countering theories of psychology's norms took pragmatic hold. Parents were to blame for offspring's deficiencies of character, even as any of America's problems were seen as resulting from Europe's dark parental heritage. Yet the democracy still envied the old world's rich creative past, so it latched upon Freudian theories connecting creativity and neurosis, and projected all of its own current tumults into a source in European decadence. The American saw himself as blazing ahead. His immediate ancestors had opened up the continent. Now, the new frontier was technology, or business, the management of the country's resources, and the acquisition of wealth, and as little government control as possible. Robber barons rose in the guise of the good Protestant burgher. No longer did religion's fear of God's retribution, hold sway over men's minds, at least not strong enough to urge caution, and psychology removed guilt or justified its sting. Guilt had little to do with the basic values and therefore justifying crimes committed in the name of competition, since man was considered a confused mixture of primitive drives and needs, yet those goals had to be leashed and directed towards society's goals. In all of this, the contemplation of the soul had little place. Meyer's theories concerning the subliminal self, after making early inroads, vanished from the mainstream of academic and philosophic life. That concept, stressing the interdependence of individual minds and the ability of superior inner knowledge, could have been used to augment democracy's basic principles to far greater advantage, stressing individuality while bolstering its responsibility and power of achievement and emphasizing its relationship with the interweaving natural and social arenas of activity. Some of Meyer's thought was incorporated into the positive thinking schools and cults. These and Freudianism, mutually contradictory theories, showed the opposing poles of American sentiment. Each had its roots reaching into Europe's past. Meyer's began with the hypothesis that man possessed an inner self of extraordinary creativity and organization, psychology's nearest corollary to the soul. Its directions could be misread. Its language was symbolic, but it was of good intent. The Freudian concept of the self lacked any good intent. That is, it was stripped of altruism in any trustworthy and purposeful form. It was the only kind of a self that could logically survive the theories of Darwin as popularly understood, the end result of an organism that survived by triumphing over other life forms in an endless battle for life. That self's one virtue was that it did survive, and if it lost its intuitive feel for nature in the process, well, that was nature's fault. Altruism, displays of valor, philosophy itself, or creativity in terms of the arts, these were only possible because of their self-serving qualities, and beneath their gentle guise lay the infant's savage determination to exist, and the male's drive to slay his father in order to supersede him in life's battle. Such theories stripped human personality of any majesty and denied the possibility of heroic action that was not tied to the meanest inner motives. For all of academia's separate precious journals, each specialized fields of knowledge overlap. These concepts splashed over into archaeology, history, biology, and tinged the arts and sciences alike. Nor did the past escape great artists of previous centuries. Great artists of previous centuries became isolated eccentrics. Their genius produced by hormonal malfunction or sexual deficiency, and history was rewritten to fit. Evolution's dogmas became Freudianism's justification. If the animal's struggle for dominance resulted in the survival of the fittest, then surely man, as the most powerful victor of that saga, must emerge as the carrier of basic drives best suited to ensure the species' continuance. The young democracy could thusly justify the unfortunate circumstances of a sometimes ruthless competition. It was each man for himself. Yet, in such a world, there would be no order at all, an issue that even the most competitive were quick to see. So the Freudian reasoning simply put, read this way: we are basically amoral, primitive, and self-serving. These qualities ensure our survival, yet they must be artificially forced into a morality that will protect us against ourselves and hence further our survival in a social and governmental context. The results of all this were mixed. Freud painted such a dire picture of man's subconscious and limited salvation to such a small number of people that spontaneity was not fostered, but instead diminished and constricted to competitive fields where it was condoned. The spontaneous self, the impulsive portion of man's nature, became most suspect, for in his spontaneous acts man could unwittingly reveal not a basic goodness, but the hidden shoddiness of his motives. The search for virtue itself became the grossest kind of moral posturing and emotional hypocrisy. The robber baron at least was honest in his dishonesty, and so the feeling went. Compassion and sympathy were not only went out of style, their expression was considered evidence of duplicity and a sanguine denial of man's nature. One species could not climb over another while feeling sympathy for its predecessor, nor could the members of any species afford pity for their less vigorous fellows. Wednesday evening, February 9th, 1977. Yet, the American soul was cautiously idealistic, even beneath the conflicting theories, and it was, in its way, innocent. If, as psychologists stated, the man was amoral at best, the end result of deadly biological evolution, a surly scrambler to the top of the heap. Here, at least, in the new democracy, if he pushed and shoved hard enough, a man could get enough to eat. He could even get his own business. His children could get an education. Here, the new social ladder was still forming. A man could leap from one business branch to another. Higher one in economic treetops, where brains and hard work took the place of the European family trees that had in the past given protection and shade to chosen generations. Here the ordinary man could be equal under the law, even if the tyranny of his nature dictated a basic amorality that pitted each man against his neighbor. He could, through willpower alone, even achieve a kind of moral victory through using some restraint. Here the suggestion, every day, in every way, I'm getting better and better, was hopefully set against Freudianism's determinism. Some of the more ambitious, of course, use such suggestions to implement their struggle in the realm of competition. The evolutionary battle transferred to the area of economics. Better and better often meant I'm getting smarter and more wily than my competitors. Business became the most creative element in American society, and then, with technological sciences catching up swiftly, finally the two were so allied that the edges blurred until, in your time, this became quite obvious as business and technology progressed together, bloated and overtly confident, dizzy in an overstimulation that culminated in American war experiences of the 20th century. Encouraged by Freudian beliefs and still operating under evolution's misconceptions, Western civilization found itself faced with the thematic situation in which no individual was considered trustworthy. but was biologically geared to undertake any course to ensure survival. The same applied to any nation. In your Second World War, the Japanese were depicted as caricatures of human beings, obviously from lower down on the evolutionary scale, and therefore not fit to survive. Wars were justified by many otherwise intelligent men as the human version of nature's unconscious evolutionary processes, and the old dictum, might is right, attained new power. Psychology and science were simply taking up where old conventional religions left off, providing a newer, more modern justification for politics of government long held in Europe. I glimpsed some of these shapes of the future with some loathing and fascination. I might add in that I saw the possibility that together all of the sciences, psychology, biology, archaeology, paleontology, might form a force that went unrecognized as a religion and yet provide an overall unity and philosophical structure as strong as that of the Roman Catholic Church in the Middle Ages. Psychology, biology, archaeology, paleontology. I did not think that this was a strong possibility, since I vastly underestimated the alliance of business, technology, and science, and it seemed to me in my time that science lacked the economic glue that held the Roman Church together. The sciences, however, did form just such a structure, and the philosophy it held unified the arts and the business and social organizations. The general views of Freudianism and evolution merged, flowed like a dark, threatening stream through all of the sciences and arts, business and social structures, so that all aspects of life, past, present, and future, were seen in what amounted to the murky but hypnotizing light of a new dogma. The university's foundations and family itself, all of these elements of American life, altered their viewpoints drastically. Though the changes were beginning in my period, and will come to an end in yours, not for many years hence will it be seen that the 20th century Western world was as united in basic scientific philosophy as the Europe of the Middle Ages was in religious rigidity. Freudianism, evolutionism, and technology became the new inspiration for the arts, and the American government sponsored those foundations that fostered those beliefs. Science fiction also was often the projection of evolutionary theories out into space, the human animal spreading his superior genes with the use of technology. Other philosophic theories were held, but they did not flourish or rush into the mainstream of American life. People were not generally jailed for holding opposing beliefs, though some were. America's freedom of speech was at least adhered to in the main, but the definitions of normality thrust upon the ordinary person were those that upheld the theories just described. They were at least limiting. At their worst, they served to alienate men from their private source of energy and strength, and to rob them of the very self-reliance that the democracy idealistically fostered. For the country did not give up its ideals. The common man held to them with desperate determination and glossy hope, with an optimism and an application to hard work that saw millions of tattered children turn into tired, bewildered, but well-dressed citizens, who then looked to the religions, arts, and so-called finer things of life, searching for an answer to the unspoken question, what did we give up to get where we are? Along the way, the religions joined largely with the business interests, settling for good works and ignoring such issues as the existence of the soul, for where could that non-scientific, unprovable phenomena fit in with the seeming facts of evolution, particularly with the popularly understood version of a man springing from a monkey? To counter science laboratories' demonstrations, what did religion have? Religion had a good case of social embarrassment and spiritual constipation. Oh, that's great. Religion had a good case of social embarrassment and spiritual constipation. There's a quote for you, eh? Many of its ancient doctrines were no longer believed, and with good reason, by anyone with sense. Religion had not cleared up its own house, and science huffed and puffed and nearly blew away the whole straw structure. Any religion is a devotional umbrella of beliefs, attitudes, and habits, collected from many sources that together form a protective and thematic framework. Some of the various elements that compose it would not alone or taken separately seem to fall within religion's domain at all. Religions often collect bits of history, science, psychology, take them out of context, and use them to strengthen other older beliefs that have seen their day. Beliefs that have left thematic holes which might weaken the structure enough to permit a raining deluge of opposing beliefs. A given religion might have at its center post reliance upon history, the Bible, a given prophet, or a basic philosophy, not originally religious in conventional terms. Its center post might be science or pseudoscience, predetermination, salvation, or any of an endless number of other hypotheses. From this center, there will be revolving spokes, each connected to the center post, and each in some way dependent upon it. While the new democracy professed to have no official religion, its main post was Christianity, with Protestantism as the handle. Democracy and Protestantism both expressed belief in the rights and abilities of the individual, self-reliance, spiritual and social betterment, the importance of good works. These were all supporting ribs in a sturdy thematic framework that was large enough to include many variations. Americans, whatever their formal religious persuasions, held to the center post firmly, espousing the rights and the abilities of the individual citizen. Freudianism weakened this center post by undermining its basic integrity of the private person upon which the entire framework hung. Religion could have quickly reinforced itself by reviving the importance of the soul, by stressing its own subjective base, and by trying to re-examine and redefine the soul in the light of the new knowledge. It could have dropped its ancient insistence upon blind faith, unsupported by any kind of reason, stood its ground against Freudianism, while accepting from psychology the invitation to explore the nature of man with an open mind. Instead, the umbrella split. The intellectuals decided to risk the storm, without religion's protection. Science and religion became like two soaking pedestrians out on the street in a rainstorm, each with half an umbrella and each pretending to be entirely dry. Fundamental religions were left with a shaggy half, the spokes of the soul stuck through the weakening dogmatic fabric, wobbling a base of blind faith that had lost its center post. For both sides dispense with the basic belief in man's innate goodness, or in the potential for heroic action of a moral nature. Each believed that controls must be applied, and neither the fundamentalist sinning self nor the Freudianist's savage instinctive self could be allowed freedom. Yet, to achieve that freedom was a national goal, an idealistic crusade to which the country was committed before the world. The dilemma was basic, and the solution was to transfer salvation from a religious to an economic and social arena, where at least the results of grace could be judged, and to depend upon technology to instill fear in men's hearts, since the fear of God no longer offered any protection. In a way, your arms race and destructive nuclear devices became necessary once man believed that he belonged to a species that killed to survive. For in that context, no person or country could be trusted to comply with civilization's niceties without the initiative of fear. It is to religion's shame that it earlier allowed the concept of the sinful self to supersede that of the heroic soul. For in the past, religion at least provided psychological devices by which the common man could ally himself with his own good intents. But Freudianism, with its savage, unconscious, never provided an adequate hope for personal salvation. There was no hope. God was abandoned. Man had outgrown him. He was, at best, a symbol of the only too fallible human father, and how could the common man rely upon a self whose very instincts now lacked the natural grace of the animals, while retaining an overly exaggerated beastliness projected as man's own? The natural world was also seen in a new light. Religion had insisted upon man's superiority over the animals, but even then it was professed to put man in the position of gentle guardian to them. When evolutionary and Freudian concepts ganged up on the natural world, however, then the environment and all its living details became fair game. And this time, when technology was turning man away from his natural and practical relationship with animals and the land, the early naturalism and romanticism of my century quickly began to vanish, yet the very soul of that land lingered and would not die. Its virgin nature broodingly was reflected in the paintings of artists, both American and visiting Europeans, and that resplendent beauty reproached literate and illiterate alike, as if its stubborn presence remained to contradict that dark and curious, cunning mixture of European psychology and Protestantism that had sprouted so threateningly upon American soil. Friday morning, February 11th, 1977. Yet those who came here came because of a determination and a hope, a faith if not in God, or man, at least in circumstances, a belief in a land of historic innocence, where one city was not built upon a counterpart whose past reached back to the time of Rome, a land not already peopled with ghosts. Those who came here despite their mistakes and despite the ghosts that they brought with them, worked heroically with what they had and formed a society that has never fulfilled its ideals because its dreams were so daring in the face of beliefs and theories that undermined the very self-reliance they hoped so to foster. In any relatively open society, where resourcefulness and vigor are prerequisites, women emerge as men's equal partners. Yet, Freudian concepts weaken the independence won by the American pioneer women by reinforcing the male's privileged position justified by Protestantism as well. The qualities that helped win the West, self-reliance, resourcefulness, courage, were, in retrospect, seen as masculine. Their very presence in a woman now cast an aspersion on her femininity. To make matters worse, the qualities that had been long admired in women were now held up to scorn. Those characteristics generally in the intuitive areas of sympathy and sentiment at which women excelled because no other avenues of expression were open to them, these now were looked upon as inferior, hysteric tendencies. Freudianism could not tolerate the intuitive abilities, for they could not be relied upon, crusted over in its eyes as they were by libidinous lusts. And in America, such qualities had no place in the factories where they would prove only disorderly and disruptive. I considered myself a man of science, an American scientist. Yet, I wanted to probe into the mind of man, into the experience and behavior of the individual, in order to find evidence of the elusive soul, not only to lessen man's fear of death, but to discover within the ordinary person those heroic abilities that could make democracy work. I strove to uncover the uncommon man, whose uncommon characteristics, those dynamics of the soul that could demonstrate the individual's ability to rule himself by a divine right granted to each citizen rather than to a crown prince or a dictator. In a way, I suppose that I tried to substitute the kingliness of the individual for the royalty of European governments. In that, of course, I was overly romantic. Hence my difficulties, which in their ways mirrored the psychic situations of other men of intelligent pretensions beside myself. We kept leaning towards peculiarly innocent American thinkers, Emerson and Whitman, for example, for their works contained American aspirations and no other. Yet we were also led back to the realities of the day, the misuse of industry, the galloping economics, and the disillusionment with nature of man himself. More and more we encountered the pessimistic and fatalistic theories that were beginning more strongly to emerge. It has been said that Freud, at least, opened the subject of the inner self to scientific inquiry, banished religion's overly stern and dogmatic insistence upon guilt by placing it in the personal subconscious, and pointed out the disastrous effects of early conditioning. Indeed, I have no quarrel with the man. His triumph was that he perceived his own nature, and to some extent that of his Germanic contemporaries, and that required the utmost daring. But, theoretically at least, had he gone further, Freud would have begun to perceive those fountainheads of creativity that his own obsessions hid from him so well, and he might have understood that his own theories were intuitive constructs, not intellectual deductions, and that they were meant to lead him elsewhere had he not stifled the process, formalizing what was only the beginning of a long search. That's an interesting sentence. I'm going to read that again. Okay. But theoretically at least, had he gone farther, Freud would have begun to perceive those fountainheads of creativity that his own obsessions hid from him so well, and he might have understood that his own theories were intuitive constructs, not intellectual deductions, and that they were meant to lead him elsewhere had he not stifled the process, formalizing what was only the beginning of a long search. Jung, it is true, followed through to some extent, yet he was also tinged by Freudian concepts to such a degree, and so dominated by the man, Freud, and the ensuing relationship, that even at the last he could not free himself sufficiently to make the leaps required. At a time when men were indeed trying to shake off the shackles of religion's meanest beliefs, Freud, in the name of science, gave them a new and dangerous foundation. Many intellectuals threw aside the idea of the soul along with the wishy-washy Christian heaven and the Dantean hell. In return, they found themselves bound by a self capable of the cruelest savagery, but incapable of the slightest deeds of heroic behavior, denied access to the soul through whose dictates man might right himself, and equipped instead with instinctive passions and self-deceptions that no man alone could hope to understand. How could such a creature be self-governing, or dare to experiment with a society in which no autocratic class ruled and maintained order out of a self-interest that at least maintained stability? The ingenious answer was the attempt to turn each man into a landowner, or at least a house owner, so that his own greed could be controlled, his needs satisfied, the animal savagery within him lulled. That was the shouted ideal. It became obvious that even with equal opportunity, men were unequal in certain quite practical respects. Some would fight their way to the top, true to their evolutionary destiny, in quotes, evolutionary destiny, and others would fall by the waysides. So how was man equal? Equal to what? And how were the rights of the individual to be protected in the struggle for survival in which only the superior would be victors? The answers were not available. Adjustments were made and remade, but no solutions to the basic problem were found, though they did exist. They did indeed exist, lying latent in Meyer's work, and perhaps even in my own, though in my own works the answers were so obscured that even I only glimpsed them when I read between my own lines. Isn't that interesting? For each person is equal to every other only when we recognize within each person the presence of an inviolate, eminently precious force of identity and meaning that possesses its own innate dignity. This dignity exists beyond our ideas of superiority or inferiority at any time in history, and the spirit within the man is equal in all degrees to the spirit within each other man. A sane and benevolent society is one that will give that inner potential equal opportunity to fulfill itself according to its own directions and intent. That inner spirit must be understood, therefore to be of good intent. The individual may not always act in a beneficial manner, but the intent of the basic self must be perceived as good, rather than evil or neutral. Freudianism, even more drastically than many religions, robbed man of the self's good intent. Some of us, embarrassed but concerned, continued our work in the face of growing disillusionment, to seek for the good intent in man, to search for the qualities of the soul, to bring the soul into scientific respectability by seeking proof for its existence through using science's own tools in objectivism, and to isolate predictably those characteristics that might show even to the most skeptical the correctness of our hypothesis. We were careful to point out that we considered such a soul as hypothetical, not labeling it as a belief, and we particularly sought proof for extraordinary perception that would place consciousness in a context that lifted it above the instinctive impulses alone. If the inner self could transcend the rules of reality hailed so proudly by the scientific community, then surely, we reasoned, scientists must be impressed with the powers of the self, and would have to grant within the mechanism of man some greater mechanism, some spiritual machinery that would lure them out of their isolation. In this search, we received little help from the established churches or the sciences, and so rather uncomfortably we found ourselves trying to maintain our professionalism, our scientific credentials, while at the same time exploring avenues of unconventional thought that we feared might turn us further away from the mainstream of American life. I, at least, persevered in that regard, forcing upon my colleagues dissertations, whether they wished to hear them or not, stiffening my professional attitude to its sensational sorry about that. That's my computer. Let's see. Where did I go? Oh, here. I at least persevered in that regard, forcing upon my colleagues dissertations, whether they wished to hear them or not, stiffening my professional attitude to its sensorial limits, and becoming almost as stuffy in my demeanor as I hoped I was free and open in my thoughts. But in such a way I guaranteed that my thoughts were heard. Yet the country endured. American optimism managed to make giant leaps over even the darkest of theories. The new country would triumph over man's unsavory nature itself, win out over the species' twisted roots, and if domination over the suspicious areas of the self was impossible, domination over the land was not. The country was physically rich. It could be mined. It could support a population. Each man could have enough for his wants and therefore have little reason to rob his neighbor. Ideals always have to be considered in the light of their practicality. Freudianism and the bleaker aspects of Puritanism merged to give Americans a true inferiority complex on the one hand, and on the other, a compensating determination to succeed as a nation. And this next part is again Jane speaking. The subject material of this chapter surprised me quite a bit in the beginning, since I've had no particular interest in 19th century America and thought, particularly as it applies to the democracy. James's discussion of the soul in reference to the American democracy was brilliant, I thought, and it made me think of the private person's concept of the self in relationship to the community, something I'd never explored before. Besides that, I have to admit that I found these nationalistic attitudes rather amusing. If there's anything like an American soul, as opposed to a French or Chinese one, for example, then James has one. Yet, as he continues with other discussions of science and religion from an American standpoint and says his piece, James moves into realms of thought so vast that all ideas of nationality disappear in visions of another world in which all earthly experiences have their source. I haven't wanted to intrude in James's manuscript except to add notes that I felt were really pertinent, because the book had its own flow. Now and then, though, check the dates of entries and you'll catch sight of that inner rhythm with which the material itself was delivered. And that concludes chapter 3. Wasn't that wonderful? I hope you're enjoying this. I certainly am. And do subscribe if you want to hear more. And click the like button to encourage me. And let's see, chapter 4. The title of chapter 4 is What Does Truth Mean? Science and Religion. Okay. Till soon.